Question. If the sun was the size of a basketball. Bzoom.
Speaking of durable goods,
those socks don't go with that shirt. Probably not going to say, hey man, when they're over in Brit. Now that's what I call home decor. The Ohio State University. What? Boo! You just burp. Today we're going to talk about the fact that God is God and you are not. When God becomes a human being, it's a really big deal. God is not angry with you. We need something new. You must be born again. I must be born again. This world is not our home. We do not get resurrection without death. Never underestimate Jesus. This was always the plan. Jesus was not gone for long. I've been really excited. There's been a lot of anticipation all year as we walk through the Gospel of John, looking towards this passage in particular. At least for me, I really feel like this is where it all comes together. I think this is why the Gospel of John was written, and this is the example we get to see of what this was all for. And so we've seen this passage several times, maybe 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 or 6. I lost count. We have read this before together. Let's read it again. It's a short passage compared to what we're used to the last few weeks or months, but let's read it and then we'll talk about it. This is John 20, starting with verse 19. Now when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut, where the disciples were together, due to the fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be to you." When he had said this, he showed them both his hands and his side. The disciples then rejoiced when they saw the Lord. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace be to you. Just as the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, their sins have been forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they have been retained." We've seen this passage before when we talked about you must be born again. When we talked about forgiveness is not optional. We even looked at how this is what empowers us to forgive. We saw when we had to ask the question, what's the difference in the disciples? Obviously, last week we saw, well, information alone isn't enough to change our hearts. Because for years they're discipled by Jesus. Every single day they're hearing his teachings. They even might understand that Jesus has risen from the dead. John believes something, but even he is in this room, huddled with the other disciples, afraid of the Jewish leaders. And yet, a few days later, they are out in the streets of Jerusalem, boldly preaching the gospel. And when they're brought before the Jewish authorities, who they fear, huddled in this room, afraid of what they're going to do, they're brought before them, and the Pharisees, the religious leaders say, "You cannot preach Jesus." They look at it and say, "We're going to obey God, not you." Every last one of them were told by tradition that they were martyred for their faith. They certainly suffered persecution. And yet they didn't mind. They experienced joy in the midst of that, including Stephen, the first martyr, experiencing joy as he's being stoned to death. There's something different that happens. Something takes place that changes everything. What is this thing that changes everything? It's not a thing, it's a person. Well, it's bigger than a person. It's God. It's his Holy Spirit. This is the moment that changes everything. Why do I feel like this is where we've been pointed the whole time? John told us, and we're going to see it next week officially, but we looked at it last week. "These things I have written to you so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Spiritual life, we've seen before, is being in close relationship with God. Spiritual death is being separated from God. Spiritual life is being reconciled to God, right? So this is the first time that we experience, that the disciples at least experienced life in Jesus when he breathes on them and they receive the Holy Spirit. Let's talk about spirit and breathing and wind for a second. In the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew, there's a word ruach. In the New Testament, in the Greek, there's a word pneuma, which we get pneumatic from, for example. Both of these words, Old Testament and New, Hebrew and Greek, mean both wind and spirit. And it isn't that in two different languages, these two words had multiple meanings. It's that in both these languages, both of those ideas were one concept. The wind and the spirit are basically the same idea. And so Jesus breathes on his disciples and says, receive the holy wind. Right? It looks a lot like when God breathed into the nostrils of Adam and he received breath and life, physical life, right? And in fact, the word breath in the Old Testament, which would have included Adam and God breathing in his nostrils, that word breath is ruach, same word as wind and spirit. So while there's maybe about 10 disciples in the room at this time, maybe there was more. We don't know exactly who was there. We know Thomas wasn't. That Judas wasn't, right? But the rest of them, they're gathered in this room, maybe others with them. Jesus breathes on them. They receive the Holy Spirit. Less than 50 days later, another larger group of disciples are gathered, and they hear the sound of like a rushing wind. And as the wind rushes in, they receive the Holy Spirit, and they are born again for the first time, and it makes a difference in their lives. This idea of the wind, we see it in John chapter 3, when Jesus said, the wind blows wherever it wishes. So it is everyone who is born of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. It was in this moment here in John chapter 20 that the disciples were born again for the first time. And they, like we said, they have life, they have reconciliation, a really, really strong, close relationship with God. It's like we're children when we're born again. And that makes sense. When you're born, you're a child, you're not an adult, right? We see in John chapter 1 that John said about Jesus, the Holy Spirit through John said about Jesus, to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God. And so it's a very reasonable question to ask when we read John chapter 1. What does it mean to receive Jesus? What does that look like on a practical level? Great thing we have chapter 20, because we see it. Jesus says, receive the Holy Spirit. When we receive it, it's because somebody is giving it. It's not taking. We have no control over the wind. We actually receive something. So if you've been wondering, you see that you're supposed to receive Jesus, you don't know what that means? This is what it means. The creator of the universe moves inside. It's not something we have control over. We certainly ask him to do it, but he's the one that does it. Receiving Jesus is not like some sort of mental exercise where I say, all right, I receive you, and it's official. Receiving is when he actually moves in. And here's the deal. Through all of this, when we receive the Holy Spirit, when we are born again, we're made his children, we become spiritually alive, obviously, this changes everything. And it's not just about us. For weeks and weeks and weeks, when we've looked towards this passage, we've really been recognizing that for us as individuals, we are transformed if the creator of the universe moves inside of us. And it does. He does change everything. But it's not just about that. That's what I want to spend the next couple minutes thinking about, is the reality that Jesus told his disciples, greater things than these miracles I'm performing, you will do. It turns out that it's Jesus who lives in us. And so, it's him that's doing it, but he's doing it through us as his body, around the world. We don't have time to walk through human history. We don't have time to look at science and the impact that God, through his Holy Spirit and his people, has actually had on the scientific revolution that has transformed the world. It came from him. We don't even really have time to talk about like William Wilberforce and the fact that for the first time in human history, a group of people were fighting for the freedom of other people that didn't look like them, were not related to them, really didn't have any relationship to them. And yet, there was this group of people who were free, fighting for the freedom of slaves in the British slave trade, and they accomplished it. Even that came from God's Holy Spirit changing things. Jesus told his disciples early on, "You are the salt of the earth." Salt is not a flavoring. He was not saying, hey, life is bland, but when the Christians show up, it's a party. He was saying you're a preservative. Salt was something that was used instead of refrigeration to keep food from spoiling. And so it has been true throughout history that wherever God's people go, and his Holy Spirit goes with them, it actually changes the world around them. Dramatically so. It even preserves their society. The very quick question we get to ask right here and now is, looking at our society, looking at the world around us in the Pacific Northwest, in North America, our culture, are we being preserved? Are we being the opposite of preserved? And if it's the opposite of being preserved, I'm inclined to think that you're welcome to disagree with me. And what's the answer to that? It isn't for us to do something because we're not big enough to do it. We need the Holy Spirit of the living God to be the one that changes everything. First changes our own hearts, and then through his people does greater things than Jesus did in his name, because it's Jesus himself who's doing it. So that's really what I want to challenge you with just right here and now, something to think about. Do you agree with me? Or it's okay. It really is okay if you disagree. But how's our society doing? Are we moving in the right direction? Are we moving in the wrong direction? We don't get to blame the world around us if it's moving in the wrong direction. That's exactly what we should expect for the world to do. It's on us in a certain way to be the salt. And if we're not the salt, we need God to do that. We need God's Holy Spirit to become the salt. On an individual level, I don't think this is a verse that I've spoken to you before. It's 2 Corinthians 13:5, where Paul told the church there in Corinth, test yourselves to see if you're in the faith. Examine yourselves. Is Jesus inside of you? That's his Holy Spirit, unless indeed you fail the test. As Christians, we are encouraged to examine ourselves first and say, do I see that Jesus lives inside of me? Has he made a great difference? Am I bearing good fruit? Is he changing everything around me? But then on a bigger scale, all of us collectively together, as his people, as his children, we get to ask the question, has the salt lost its saltiness? And if so, what are we going to do about it? I think the answer is we need to ask him to move his Holy Spirit, his mighty wind, which changes everything. We need to ask him to do that. And I would even encourage you in your core groups, as you pray for one another, never fail to pray for one another, lift up your requests. That's an important thing in a way that we can support each other. Add to your list this week that God would also be moving in his people, in the church, through his Holy Spirit. Give the salt its flavor back again. Make the salt salty again. You might call it a revival, a renewal, a reformation, whatever you want to call it. It has to be God. And I just urge you to pray that he would do that. Have a wonderful core group time. Be blessed. I pray that the Spirit, we all pray for you in your core groups, that the Holy Spirit would make the scriptures come alive and really connect in a new way with each one of us. So be blessed. I love you guys, and I will see you next week.